For the annual lecture series, Imagining a Just World Order, officially sponsored by the Social Action Committee, by Ollie, and by the Unitarian Church. We will go through this quickly so the speaker will have all the time possible. This is also brought to you in part by the Humanities Council, which is why we have you sign in out there so we can keep track. We always did that in Ag Extension too. Additional funding from the Nebraska Cultural Endowment. So if you enjoy this type of programming, please consider supporting the Nebraska Humanities Council, now called Humanities Nebraska, I just forgot. Any donations are matched by state and federal funds. I hope they have some left over for the university. Let's see. This helps inform our past and inform our future. Okay. We'll have a 1-hour lecture by Professor Coble. Then a short break, 10 to 15 minutes with coffee and cookies out in the fireplace room, and then come back here for about 3/4 of an hour for questions and answers. There are 3 more lectures in the series, plus a panel discussion. So as long as the ice doesn't keep you home, please come back. There is, overflow parking across the street by Pius in their parking lot. If there is inclement weather, you can go to the website, www.unitarianlincoln.org. Let's see, what else? Oh, during the break, please enjoy coffee, tea, water. Please leave your cups and things out there so we won't have to come in here and pick up cups and interrupt things. There is hearing assistance available. We have a couple of sets if you need some additional amplification. Let's see, one announcement for Ollie. There's a symposium looking at issues affecting women coming up in 2 weeks from tomorrow. The title is Our Healthcare. Let's talk about it. There are a series of panelists. There's a keynote speaker the first night. It's on Monday, March 12th, and you should register by about 4 days before that. Time is 1 to 4 p.m. Southeast Community College with a modest cost. Okay, it's a real honor and pleasure to introduce my university colleague, Dr. Parks Coble, who is the Sellers Professor of History here at UNL. He has degrees from South Carolina and 2 degrees from University of Illinois. He's been a visiting scholar at a whole bunch of famous places you've heard of, like Stanford, Princeton, Harvard, Queensland University, and a number of universities in China. He did a Fulbright in Taiwan back before the changes and has traveled extensively in China, so he's a China expert. He has many publications in his CV. I think several of them I can't read to you because they're in Chinese. So. But I do assume that tonight's talk will be in English. Is that right? Yes. So we welcome you. The title is The Collapse of Chiang Kai-shek's China, Hyperinflation and Its Consequences. So
that's not my talk, that's my current research.
Well, that's your, I'm sorry. It says right here, current research is. Okay. Okay.
The just
You'll give the title. You want the time. Okay, thank you for coming and joining us tonight. But he's not going to have a PowerPoint. Isn't that great?
Yes, I'm afraid I'm one of the few faculty members left in my department who doesn't. Oh, is that good? Sorry? Here we go. No? Okay. Thank you. I think you can see why I don't use PowerPoint. Can't even turn the mic on. Okay, how's that? That's better.
You asked those.
All right. Everybody can hear me now? No? Not yet.
I don't think it's on.
Oh.
Have you went on?
Should it be on now?
No.
No?
There's no wind.
How did I get the green button on? There we are. Is that good? Oh, yeah, okay. Too good? All right. Okay. No? Well, I'm having trouble with this.
That's right, that thing is not standing on. Our, the green button didn't stay on.
Okay. All right, this is good. Well, now that I think everybody can hear me, I'd like to thank everyone for coming and being invited to give this lecture tonight. When I start teaching a course on modern China every year, I usually ask my 19-something-year-olds what they think of China. And almost inevitably, the first thing mentioned is that China is a giant in the global economy. Someone will mention that it has the world's second largest economy after the United States, but is gaining on us and is likely in their lifetime to surpass the United States to be the world's largest economy. They also will say that China is the world's factory, that virtually every toy they ever had growing up was made in China, that if you go to Costco or Walmart, more or less everything you see there is, or a lot of it is made in China. And particularly if they're in business, they know that virtually all major global companies have a presence in China, and some Chinese companies invest in the United States, like IR. They know also that China is a major trading partner of the United States. Some of them will mention perhaps that China runs a trade surplus, which has been criticized, most notably by candidate Donald Trump. And if I have a few from students in western Nebraska that I often do, many of them are aware of the fact that China is a huge consumer of Nebraska products. Slightly over half of all the beef sold to China from the United States comes just from the state of Nebraska. So that trade surplus is not our state, it's the whole country. We benefit greatly from sales to China. Some students might mention that the Chinese currency, the yuan, is increasingly seen as a global currency and that it could challenge the dollar and the euro if it still exists in the future. And they also are aware that China buys a lot of U.S. debt. They have purchased about $1.1 trillion of our government debt assets. And finally, somebody's going to mention that China is the biggest country in the world with a population pushing 1.4 billion. And then they'll add that Chinese are globally active and travel. They're tourists everywhere. And in most American public universities, the largest group of international students is Chinese. And that's true at UNL. And that almost doesn't have to be mentioned because there will usually be several students from China in the class. But there are also some negative things that eventually people will bring up. That China is seen as a rival of the United States with growing military strength that's been increasing very rapidly. Some will particularly mention the fortified islands in the South Seas, as they're called in China, off the Philippines, that proposes that leads to a strategic challenge for the United States. And they'll also point out that the current leader, Xi Jinping, the leader of China, has a very aggressive program. I don't think anyone has mentioned the title One Belt, One Road, but it's a very aggressive initiative by Xi. And if you follow the news this morning, you know that since Deng Xiaoping, they've had this rule that the president of China serves 2 5-year terms and then retires. And that's been the norm for the last few decades. But Xi has been setting the stage for becoming a more permanent leader and a more dominant leader. And they're going to amend the constitution of the party to allow him to serve a 3rd term, at least for now. And there are also challenges with Japan and China, and Japan is our ally. Finally, someone will invariably mention that China has a very poor human rights record, which is essentially accurate. However, that's what 19-year-olds think of China, but looking around the room here, I suspect that everyone remembers another China, what we used to call when I was growing up Red China, that we had virtually no contact with. And I think it's hard to recall how different China is today from then. But actually, I arrived here at the University of Nebraska in the summer of 1976, and the first time I taught a course on the history of modern China, Chairman Mao was still alive. He died a few weeks after the course started. And the China of that day was remarkably different. It was a very, very poor country. It was exceedingly isolated. China had almost no foreign trade, very limited. Very few foreign companies worked in China. Very few foreigners ever visited China, despite Nixon. Even Eastern Bloc visitors were very slim in those days. And almost no Chinese came to the United States. There were no Chinese students on our campus. It was quite a while even before we had many visiting scholars. The Chinese educational system in 1976 was still in tatters in the Cultural Revolution. Many universities had been closed for years. Senior professors had committed suicide or were psychologically traumatized by the Cultural Revolution. When Mao died, China had fewer PhDs than the Philippines, which of course is a much smaller country. And the science and technology level of China had fallen well behind the global standard. And virtually nothing made in China was sold in the United States in those days. It had been embargoed for a long time, but the products simply were not competitive. There were no markets in China. Chairman Mao did not approve of them. State and collective enterprises controlled everything. And food supplies were quite inadequate in those days. There was still a lot of malnutrition and even starvation in rural areas. The Chinese currency was completely non-convertible. You could not exchange it. The first time I went to the People's Republic was when I was here, with a People's Friendship Delegation, they called them in those days. You couldn't just go. You had to go as part of a group. You gathered in Hong Kong and you arrived in Beijing, where you were greeted by your guide. You had a national guide and local guides. You were given special, we call it monopoly money, foreign exchange certificates, that you could expend at friendship hotels and go to friendship shops to shop, and you could eat in friendship restaurants at tourist attractions like the Great Wall, which local Chinese could not do. They could not enter the friendship stores or the hotels or the restaurants, and you were taken to carefully scripted model communes and things of that type. Totally, utterly different from today's experience. But I think we even forget that militarily, Pentagon thought China was pretty negligible in those days. It is true they had the atomic bomb, and it is true they fought pretty fiercely in Korea. But the People's Liberation Army had been badly damaged by purges in the Cultural Revolution period. A huge number of the top military leaders were purged in the aftermath of those struggles. And after the communist victory in Vietnam in 1979, China launched an invasion of Vietnam because Vietnam had invaded Cambodia in February of 1979. This is a war that virtually is never mentioned in China today. It's just totally covered up. But 250,000 Chinese troops invaded, and they fared very, very poorly. The Vietnamese army was battle-hardy, as we know, and they had a lot of very good equipment that we had left in Vietnam, meaning the United States. And some estimates are that as many as 50,000 Chinese died in that war, which is almost as many as Americans died in a much, much longer conflict. But basically China declared, or Deng Xiaoping declared victory and withdrew, realizing things weren't going well. The only two things people mention that are roughly the same in 1976 and today is China's the largest country in the world. In 1980, it had about 1 billion people, and that it has a poor human rights record, which it did that as well. But think about this. All of these changes from what I just described, Mao's China, to what China is today, happened not just in my lifetime, but in my professional lifetime. Now, I was a much younger person in 1976, obviously, but I was teaching a course on the history of modern China, and while I was doing that, China became a totally different country. And I think basically no country of that scale, well, China is 1/5 of the world's population, has totally changed its role in the world from being virtually isolated completely to being one of the dominant global players economically and in almost every other way. And I think when we think about the globe today, we have to factor that in. It's just, whether you're talking about carbon emissions or human rights or any other feature of the global economy or global situation, this radical, complete change of this huge nation is really fundamental. Now, I would say that basically this is a good thing, what happened. That it's in, first of all, as a humanist, this series of events lifted more people out of poverty than any other single event of that duration in world history. I mean, just, not overnight, but in the space of a few decades, the rate of poverty in China has decreased dramatically. And I can't tell you how different the China that I visit today is from the one I visited with the People's Friendship Delegation, which was, people were clothed rather poorly, everybody was pretty skinny, and it was a very, very different place. And I think we also have to consider, what if it had failed? And it came close to failing a few times. The fact of the matter is that if the Deng Xiaoping's reform and opening program that he launched had failed, China could simply be a very large North Korea, a country totally cut off from the outside world, with a population that was isolated, but with a very skilled high-tech core, and with ICBMs that really could deliver multiple warheads to the United States. In China, I think this would be a much more frightening world. So I don't think we should regret what happened. I think that the success of China has been a success for all humanity in that way. Now, I think one factor to consider is that the rise of China is seen by many as it's a zero-sum game, as many people see it. So China's rise is our decline. But I think that the transition has been remarkably smooth, given the magnitude of the change thus far. I'm not as confident that it will be in the future for a couple of reasons. One is, I won't elaborate on it, but presidential leadership by tweeting is not the best way to run a foreign policy necessarily. But on the Chinese side, Xi Jinping has been more aggressive than any Chinese leader recently. And the fact that he's going for a third term is indication that he's shaking things up. So the future could be rockier, and I think that's something we have to be concerned about. But before I go back to the theme of the just world order, I think I might like to talk a little bit about some of the reasons why I think that transition has been smooth, because I think it says a lot about the nature of Chinese-American interaction, which fundamentally is critical to this sort of global change. Basically, I would say the interaction between China and the United States has been more of a symbiotic relationship. We both benefited from a lot of the changes in China, although we often don't recognize it. But over the last few years, the United States has had remarkably low inflation. And one of the factors that has caused this is that manufactured goods from China that you buy now at Costco and Walmart are actually very cheap, very inexpensive. The environment in which they're made in China is extremely competitive. And as a result, I think that the price of these commodities that most working class Americans buy have been kept in check, and that's one of the key factors involved. If we impose tariffs, this will lead to a rise in prices that will particularly affect middle and lower income people. Senator Sass just pointed out that when the Trump administration imposed a 14% tax or tariff on washing machines, that what that really means is when you go to buy a washing machine, it's going to cost you 14% more than it did before, regardless of whether it's made in America or China. And I suspect if we did put high tariffs on the products China makes, that a lot of those jobs would never come back to America. They would go to Mexico or to Vietnam or Indonesia or Bangladesh. In fact, they're already doing that. Another factor, I think, is that many American corporations, or at least large global corporations, have really benefited from being in China, partly taking advantage of China's low wages and lax environmental rules, at least in the past. But, for example, General Motors sells more cars in China than in the United States. Many American universities, in fact, a large number of public universities, including the University of Nebraska, have come to rely on the tuition revenue generated by Chinese students, most of whom pay out-of-state tuition. And I think what's happened is that essentially the United States and the Chinese economy are so intertwined that a recession in China means a recession in the United States. They're virtually inseparable. For example, I just mentioned earlier that China is buying or has bought $1.1 trillion of American debt. And there have been recent mumblings that the central bankers in China are very concerned about what appears to be a huge increase in deficit spending by the United States with the huge tax cut, but no cut in government spending. And they see this as likely leading to inflation and a decline of the dollar. And smartly, they want to diversify their holdings. And so there's some talk they will cut their consumption or their purchase of American debt and US dollar assets. And this is seen by many as a threat to America. We've allowed China to become able to control us. But the flip side of that, of course, is for China, the United States is the proverbial bank that's too big to fail. Because if they dump dollars, the dollar declines. They have a huge amount of assets in US dollars, and that will be worth less. So in effect, we are in kind of locked together, where they need the dollar to be relatively strong, and they need America to buy Chinese products. So we are really, it's a very different kind of relationship. And just think 1 minute go back to the Cold War and the United States and the Soviet Union when we confronted one another. Think about how engaged we were or weren't with the Soviet Union then. Very few Soviet citizens visited the United States or studied here, just the occasional scholar. Very few American companies operated in the Soviet Union. It wasn't very easy, and vice versa. And the idea that you would go to, well, then it would have been maybe Woolworths or something like that, and buy a product made in the Soviet Union. Did you ever see one? Despite there were legal barriers, as I recall. But the key thing was that consumer goods made in the Soviet Union had a reputation for being drab and rather shoddily made. So they weren't at all competitive. So if we in the Soviet Union clashed, we weren't that engaged to begin with. And that's why I think the U.S.-China relationship has not been nearly as threatening or as volatile because there's too much interaction and interdependence with the two nations. And I think that's still going to continue. And that's a cause for optimism, that we're in this together and we have mutual interests that benefit both sides. And that is very, very critical. Before I move on to some other things, I want to mention one other factor that I don't think we often think about. I think it's fairly clear in the United States that a small number of extremely wealthy people hold a huge portion of assets, the top 1% and so on, or just the top leading wealthiest people in the United States, the top 100 have a huge amount of control over money and income in this country. Now, there might be disagreement as to whether this is something that needs to be corrected or is a good thing, because it stimulates the economy with the famous trickle-down effect. But the bottom line is, I think you would probably agree that these wealthy people have more clout than you and I. The fact of the matter is that if corporations think the corporate tax rate is too high, they can park assets overseas. It's a lot easier to move money around these days. And they can also try to change the politics so that they get a huge tax break, which they just did. Now, the interesting thing, I think, is that actually Of the other world's largest economies, the one that most resembles the U.S. in that regard is China. China probably has, after the United States, the most billionaires of any country in the world. There are a large number of incredibly wealthy individuals. The interesting thing, though, is that they're all nouveau riche. That is, they all made their money while I was teaching history at the University of Nebraska, because everybody was more or less equally poor. Some of the government leaders, like Chairman Mao, I'm sure had some special privileges, but basically you did not have billionaires. And every time I go to China, I'm reminded of that because I can remember what it was like before. I was in Shanghai a couple of years ago when I was walking on the Bund, the waterfront, and the chimes rang out the tune for The East is Red, which was sort of the theme song of the Cultural Revolution. The East is red, the sun is rising, China has produced a Chairman Mao. And that revolutionary song was the one the Red Guards always sang. And just as I was sort of humming that along, because I remember hearing it so much, a chauffeur-driven Porsche SUV pulled up, and a chauffeur opened the door, and two young ladies dressed to the nines got out and walked over, and another doorman opened the door to the Dolce & Gabbana boutique. And I thought, Chairman Mao would not like this at all. And I think that this rapid change has resulted in a sort of Wild West mentality among Chinese business elite that even by our standards is pretty blatant. The fact of the matter is that in the United States, we tend to consider private property very secure. And we also often, many people look up to big business leaders. Warren Buffett's kind of a folk hero, that kind of thing. But in China, there's still a huge amount of that Marxist rhetoric ideology around. It's led by a communist party. And so the disjuncture between the rhetoric of Marxism, Leninism, Maoism, and the reality of these very, very wealthy individuals is really very stark. And also, they still have a huge regulatory set of rules and regulations that are very opaque. And they have almost unlimited power by Communist Party officials, particularly at the local level. And the result of all of this is that I think business practices are essentially all illegal. That is, you could arrest almost any wealthy person in China for any number of things, and they often are. You find that Chinese businesses in Africa, places like that, engage in some really appalling practices that are often brought up. I don't think we need to be too critical of China without looking at our own history, because a lot of American corporations were supportive of some activity that is not particularly environmentally conscious and things like that. And for example, during the Cold War, we would support almost any corrupt political regime as long as they were on our side. And now it's if they're opposed to Islamic fundamentalism. And China does the same thing. In Africa, their quest for resources is pretty dramatic. But the reason I bring this up in part is there's kind of a back channel to a lot of the stuff that happens with China that isn't immediately apparent. But for example, China's been running a huge trade surplus, which means that American dollars and other foreign currencies should be stacking up in the banks in China. And in a regular economics model, this means that the value of the Chinese yuan should escalate. And in fact, since Xi Jinping's corruption campaign has started, that's happened. But earlier, and this happened like with Japan, they had this trade surplus. The value of the yen has gone up and stayed high. And that's why, for example, you can't really manufacture competitive products in Japan. That's why Kawasaki makes subway cars and jet skis in Lincoln, Nebraska, not in Kawasaki, Japan. But for a long time, and up until just recently, really, the central bank in China kept intervening in the market, not to depress the value of the Chinese yuan to keep their goods competitive, but actually to shore it up. Something was going on that was not adding up. And what was going on was
a huge amount of money was leaking out of China, laundered through Hong Kong and Macau with dummy corporations and things of that type. And some of it was from government officials and others was from the new billionaires of China. And the reason for this is that no one who has money in China feels that it is secure. And there's a good reason for that. It is not secure. So they try to get their money out of China. And it goes all the way to the top. The prime minister from 2003 to 2013 was Wen Jiabao, who was served under Hu Jintao. It's a kind of the second leading position in China. In 2012, the year before he retired, the New York Times reported that his family, his wife and children, had amassed about $2.7 billion US in assets while he was prime minister. And that money, some of it was rumored to have been laundered out of China. The flip side of this is that Xi Jinping has been running a anti-corruption campaign, and that campaign has led him to target key officials in government who are corrupt by the standards they use to judge. But he targets people he wants to get rid of, basically. That's how he's managed to get the overwhelming position of strength. And for example, there was an article in the New York Times last week that one of Wen Jiabao's closest, well, his wife's closest business ally, a woman named Wan Weihong, was finally being investigated. She's one of the wealthiest women in China. She has homes in New York and London, but she's now not allowed to leave China, but she's gotten some of the money out. Another case, a guy who was really set to challenge the system was Bo Xilai, a member of the Politburo, and he was brought down in 2012 when his wife supposedly murdered a British businessman. But his son, Bo Guagua, was studying at Harvard Business School at the time and living in a luxury condominium, and then later went to Columbia. And as a result of that, the rumor is that he's managed to get several $1 million out of China to secure his future here. And if his dad can ever leave, could join him, but his other siblings could. But lately, Xi Jinping has taking on some of these millionaires. And this past week, Anbang Insurance Company, which was one of China's largest insurance companies, it's perhaps known to you, if at all, because they bought the Waldorf Astoria in New York, and the government took this over. Another businessman, one of the largest owners of a holding company called Tomorrow Group Holding, was kidnapped out of his hotel room in Hong Kong and taken back to China. And even Guangcheng, who was called the Warren Buffett of China, was arrested for a time in 2015. And his companies average $11 billion in profits every year. Now, what does this all have to do with the just world order? I think that you have to look at this side of China and its economy and the operation of Chinese business people to really quite grasp sometimes what is happening. Because a lot of this money is channeled into things like luxury condominiums in New York City, with Trump and Tower, for example. One of the fugitive billionaires holds out at Mar-a-Lago. So there's kind of a back channel that often, well, particularly right now, impacts American-Chinese relations that may not be quite as obvious. And I think there's also a threat to China's economic growth because when one of these leaders is arrested, or they don't say that, they disappear from public view, this immediately impacts the value of their stock on the Hong Kong index and elsewhere, or the Waldorf Astoria. If you're thinking of a Chinese partner and you want to work out an investment deal, you worry that this individual might disappear at some point. So this is something we have to consider. So now I finally better get to the theme, the just world order. And I can assure you that whatever that is not on Xi Jinping's to-do list. He would probably think that it was an American plot for intervening in China's affairs, criticizing for their human rights record and things of that type. But I would say no, it isn't on their agenda. And I would never ask the question, what does China want? Because I can't imagine that 1.4 billion people want the same thing. But we could ask what Xi Jinping and the members of the Standing Committee of the Political Bureau, the Politburo, of the Chinese Communist Party Central Committee want. That's a little easier. It's still not very easy. And I'm going to suggest that one way to do this, being a historian, of course, is to go back in history to when Mao died in 1976 and see how the reform and opening proceeded. And I think we can get some idea of what Xi is up to. Mao died in 76. 2 years later, Deng Xiaoping, who had been a very top communist leader, but had been purged twice by Mao, managed to come back and gain power. And he decided that China wanted, or had to, open and change. One reason was very obvious. China was losing ground, and I think I indicated that in my opening remarks. In 1960, the gross national product of China and Japan was virtually equal. Japan had just recovered really from World War II. Of course, per capita, Japan was a lot wealthier. In 1980, Japan's gross national product was 4 times that of China. And in 1984, it peaked out at 5 times that of China. And it wasn't just China. Taiwan, Singapore, Hong Kong, ethnically Chinese enclaves were doing much better. South Korea was taking off. And Deng Xiaoping realized that in a world where economic clout counted for a lot, if that continued, China would be a non-entity by the 21st century. And so he opened this opening and reform policy. But the problem for Deng Xiaoping was he wanted economic growth, which meant opening up China, sending students overseas, getting foreign investment. But he didn't want any political change. He was a hardline communist who wanted rule by the Communist Party. And he was a little elderly, so he picked younger people. He turned to a guy named Hu Yaobang, and then purged him later and turned to Zhao Ziyang. And he felt both of these guys were becoming China's Gorbachev, which was not what he wanted at all. And the second guy, Zhao Ziyang, was actually the one you may remember in June of 1989, when there was the huge demonstrations in the Tiananmen crackdown. He actually went down to talk to the students when he learned, he knew he was going to be out, and met with them and said he was sorry he couldn't do anything. He was then put under house arrest and he died a couple of years ago. But Deng then turned to some hardliners like Li Peng, who had engineered the crackdown and the Tiananmen incident. But then Deng realized that the hardliners actually were hardline communists who did not favor a market economy or having private business or having billionaires. And so the economic reforms stalled. And for a couple of years, China's economy was flatlining. And so in 1989, Deng did something really remarkable. He went on the southern tour. He visited these special economic zones where foreign companies were operating. And it was just a publicity stunt. He went to these places, he praised the growth of the economy, and he said some people will get rich before others. And just his actions alone sort of reinvigorated the economic progress. And some of the hardliners fell by the wayside, and some more moderate leaders came in, and the rest is sort of history. But I think there was a understanding when he came back, what was going to happen in China was, we'll do anything we have to keep the economy growing. We're going to deliver on the economic basis, and that's a pledge, but we're not going to allow any political change at all. We're going to be a one-party dictatorship. And that's basically what the policy of China's been. And Xi Jinping has really accentuated that policy to some degree. And I'll just give you, you probably know some of these things, but for example, the famous dissident Liu Xiaobo advocated democracy and multi-party elections. He was arrested in June of 2009 for inciting subversion of state power and was sent to prison. When he got the Nobel Peace Prize in 2010, he was not allowed to attend. His wife, now widow, was not allowed to attend. And China severely criticized Norway for interfering in Chinese politics. and he died in prison in 2017. Some say he wasn't given any medical attention. But I think what I would say is that that's the limit. They don't care what you think of their human rights record. They're not going to allow political change or challenge to the one-party rule. China also spends billions of dollars on what is called the Great Firewall of China, which are their internet blocks, so that when you go to China, your Facebook account doesn't work, Twitter, Google, and a bunch of other stuff, because they want to isolate China from the more open parts of the global internet, which is very, very difficult to do, and it's kind of a cat and mouse game. But if you're not going to allow any political change, how do you motivate people to support the Chinese Communist Party and keep them on track, not to make trouble? And there's been a consistent campaign since Deng Xiaoping came back to stress nationalism as a way of organizing and motivating the Chinese people. You can't really promote Marxist-Leninist Maoist ideology because if you see billionaires running around in chauffeur-driven Porsche SUVs, basically Chairman Mao said, you need to revolt and kill these people and take their property, which is kind of his policy. And so they kind of totally downplayed that and promoted this idea. And it's a very selective promotion of history. If you go to China, you'll see grainy black and white documentaries on TV all the time, which I don't think too many people watch, about the revolution and the Communist Party. But you also see a lot of things about China's century of humiliation, which is also played up in school textbooks, museums, the beginning of the downfall of China in the 19th century with the Opium War, and then later the Second Opium War when the British and French occupied Beijing and burned the Summer Palace and so on. That is really brought up again and again and again because it suggests that if we let our guard down for a moment and we have chaos and we aren't unified, China could fall back into this pattern. Another thing that's played up again and again and again are Japanese atrocities in World War II, which are very horrendous and are a valid thing to bring up, but they're really stressed to a high degree. And other things aren't mentioned. For example, the Great Leap Forward, the famine after that is rarely mentioned in public, or the chaos of the Cultural Revolution is really downplayed today. So what I would suggest is this is one of the mechanisms they've been using. But they've even gone back to some more historic figures. I mentioned the name the Qianlong Emperor. That rings a bell with most of you. He came to the throne of the Qing dynasty, the last dynasty, in 1735, and he ruled China till he died at 87 years old in 1799. He had actually abdicated 4 years earlier, because his grandfather, the Kangxi Emperor, had set the record for the longest reigning emperor in Chinese history at 60 years. And he thought it would be unfilial, that Confucian virtue there, to break granddad's record. And as a young boy, his granddad had taken him hunting a lot, and he was supposed to be the favorite grandson. So he didn't want to damage his father's memory. By the way, being the favorite grandson was not an easy task because you have the whole imperial harem. The Kangxi Emperor, his grandfather, had 24 adult sons and several dozen grandchildren. So it wasn't like picking between Prince William and Prince Harry for your favorite, and you have a large pool. But he was vilified in the Maoist times, and textbooks referred to him as a feudal ruler who sucked the blood out of the working masses of China. And he was even criticized for being a foreigner. He was Manchu ethnicity rather than Chinese. But today, he's often glorified in TV programs, and the maps show the Qianlong Emperor's vast empire, which included a lot more territory, a lot of what is now the Soviet Union, Russia, Vladivostok, and all of that was part of the Qing dynasty. And he added a huge amount of territory to China. He had some problems with the Western Mongols, the Dzungar Mongols, and he sent army after them and basically exterminated them. But in the process, he captured a huge new area which is actually today about 1/4 of the territory of China, the Northwest. It's mostly empty, but it's a desert, but the people who lived there were Uyghurs and Kazakhs, who are Turkish peoples, they're Muslims. They have very little in common with Chinese, and they saw the Qianlong Emperor as an infidel ruler, and they were very restive. There were uprisings there in 1765, 1815, 1817, 1847, 1854, 1857, and they were all suppressed militarily. And then the biggest was when the Qing was occupied with other things, 1862 to 78, when new armies were sent into there with Western weapons now and obliterated opposition. The reason I mention this is, of course, today this is one of the major internal problems China faces. There's been a lot of unrest in the Northwest, and China's arrested a large number of the key leaders of the Uyghur movement. Earlier, to improve relations with Middle Eastern oil companies, China had allowed these people to go on the Hajj and also to study at universities in the Middle East. And they virtually closed that program down. So the legacy of the Qianlong Emperor is brought up in part because it says that this is legitimately Chinese territory. Another example are the Tibetans. The Qianlong Emperor got a bit nervous about the Tibetans and what they were up to, and he asserted the right to pick the Dalai Lama. As you probably know, the Tibetan Buddhists believe that when a lama like the Panchen Lama or Dalai Lama dies, his spirit is reincarnated in a new baby, and you have to go find the boy to be the new leader. And when the Qianlong Emperor did not like who the candidates in Lhasa had been picked, he came up with a golden urn, which he asserted he had the right to put in the names of suitable people, boys, ones that he wanted, and that they could pick from that group. But it was ultimately his choice. He didn't stop there. He had the Tibetan Church declare him a reincarnation of the Bodhisattva Manjushri, who was one of the key bodhisattvas in Buddhism. So he's actually being worshipped in the Buddhist church. And he would bring the young Dalai Lama to Beijing and help raise him. Did, in some ways, a good job. He had a 2/3 to replica scale of the Potala Palace in Lhasa built at the summer getaway for the emperors and the Dalai Lama. But in 1750, when there were riots in Lhasa, this was his opportunity. He dispatched an army to suppress the rebellion and sent the Dalai Lama he had picked back out there to rule under military support. By the way, he had a little help from his Jesuit advisor, Father Felix de la Roca, who actually helped him, or his military people, devise a type of mortar that would operate or fire in the high altitude and thin air of Lhasa. So what I'm suggesting here is that the Qianlong Emperor's resurgence perhaps has something to do with today's political situation. In 1995, the second leading Tibetan leader, the Panchen Lama, died, and so the search went out for a successor, and the local people, religious leaders, came up with a young boy, Gudhun, but the Beijing government challenged this, and he was removed from public view, and he's never been seen in public since. And they brought the golden urn out again, and they found another candidate, Ganseng Norbu. My Tibetan's not very good, and he is now the Panchen Lama, who more or less follows Beijing's line. And when the Dalai Lama, who of course lives outside of Tibet, in India and around the world, when he dies, and he's getting quite elderly, you can be certain that Beijing will pull the golden urn out again and pick someone suitable to lead Tibetan Buddhist in China. So what I'm suggesting is that the worldview that we have of Xi Jinping may actually owe a lot to the Qianlong Emperor. Aside from the areas I just mentioned, he had the right, he thought, for uncontrolled loyalty of all people in China. but also even of knowledge. He came up with this idea of a massive encyclopedia, and he published eventually 26,000 volumes in the Emperor's Encyclopedia. And he sent teams of 300 scholars around China to famous libraries, and they looked at all the old books and they copied the ones they thought were significant. But the other thing they did was they also looked for books that were considered subversive, anything that might be considered against the Manchus or the emperor or just not supportive of the government. And over 10,000 books were destroyed. So it's sort of the equivalent of the Great Firewall of China, but in a more primitive fashion. And so I think the whole One Belt, One Road initiative, the move into the South Seas, this idea of the world view from Xi Jinping's perspective is maybe a little bit like the Qianlong Emperor. Here's China, this is us, and we won't tolerate splitism, and that we expect a certain amount of deference from the areas around us. And that approach to things is, I think, kind of how things are standing today. And Xi Jinping has been laying the groundwork for his elevation in status for some time. This fall they had the 19th Party Congress, and they revised the party constitution. And I'll just read this. The Communist Party of China uses Marxism-Leninism, Mao Zedong thought, Deng Xiaoping theory, the theory of three represents, which no one really ever understood, the scientific outlook on development, and Xi Jinping thought on socialism with Chinese characteristics for a new era as it guides to action. So he's elevated his thought to the level of Chairman Mao, and I think that's an indication of kind of where he's going. Now the question is, will this work? And I think there is an inherent problem from the goals I just outlined. The Chinese economic explosion took place against the backdrop of reform and opening. It required lots of Chinese to come overseas, study around the world, do business around the world. And it required a lot of access to information. And if you try to cut one part of information off, anything political or even whatever is on Facebook, you cut that off. You also risk business communications that go back and forth being restricted or even just delayed. And also for foreign businessmen who go to China, a lot of them are finding it increasingly unattractive to be there. It's very modern, you've got all kinds of things, but everyone under, well, probably 50 seems to be totally addicted to their phone. And they get, my students, like they're shaking after 15 minutes if they don't have access to whatever it is they're looking at. I'd rather not know. And so they get to China and they can't access a lot of their stuff. Now they do have these VPNs that a lot of these foreigners use in China, but they're cracking down on those. And so I think that there is a political price to pay. I happened to have been in China this past fall when they had the 19th Party Congress. And I just don't know if today's young people in China will buy all of this. It reminded me very much of the Maoist era. There was the great leader waving, like Chairman Mao did. At one point, apparently, they had 4 minutes of uninterrupted applause of the delegates just waving at him, which they did for even longer for Mao. I was told, I don't know if this is really true, that there was actually a app you could get on your phone where you tapped your phone to indicate applause, and they were tallying this out. I was told that by a Chinese who said he had seen this, but who knows. But the other thing they did things they used to do in the past. They had they moved a TV shot from Inner Mongolia, and they had these people dressed up in these fake Mongolian outfits in a fake yurt. And they're warmly applauding the leadership and the words of the Central Committee of the Chinese Communist Party and our leader, blah, blah, blah. And I'm looking at that, and it happened, I was at a conference at a Chinese university, and I was in the breakfast room where they have those buffet breakfasts, and they're probably 3 times the size of this room, and filled, and probably 2 foreigners in the room, everybody else is Chinese. And the TV was up there, and I was kind of looking at it, and I realized I was the only person looking at the TV. The Chinese people have seen all this before, and they don't necessarily want to see it again. And so I guess the other thing I saw was Lei Feng. Most of you probably don't know that name, but he was a model worker and hero and soldier that was the model for young Chinese back in the day. He died in a work accident in 1962 at the age of 21, and they found his diary, supposedly, where he talked about how he was serving the revolution and doing all of this stuff. And I thought, these young Chinese who are on their phones all the time, who have access to global entertainment, are they going to, I don't think people bought, a lot of young people didn't buy Lei Feng back in the Cultural Revolution period, and I don't know if they will buy it today. So where does this leave me? Well, with no time, which is kind of the idea of wrapping things up. What I would suggest is that I don't think we can count on Xi Jinping to be concerned about the just world order that we might be talking about here. But that's not to say that China could not contribute to such an order if it meets the interest of China as seen by Xi Jinping. And that does include continuing economic growth, cooperation with other countries, and moderating disputes so that they don't lead to economic catastrophe in the world, basically.